water. As important to life as the air we breathe and the food we eat. 70% of the Earth's surface is water, but less than 1/100% of that water is fresh water, held in lakes, rivers, and streams. Historically, we have relied heavily on this small supply of fresh water for drinking, agriculture, energy production, transportation, fishing, recreation, and industry. Early towns and cities were located near rivers and lakes because of our need for fresh water. However, the concentration of goods and services and jobs in these cities has led to an explosion in the number of people living in these urban areas. In fact, almost half of the world's population now lives in cities, putting an enormous stress on urban water resources. Industrial effluents, hospital waste, runoff from city streets and sewage all result in degraded water quality. Moreover, urban expansion and development create the need for flood protection, resulting in aquatic habitat alteration, degradation, and destruction. Experts predict that by the end of the 21st century, over 80% of the world's population will be concentrated in urban areas. Moreover, an increasing number of urban poor will rely on urban waterways for recreation, food, and escape from urban pressures. Today, the sad state of our urban waterways presents a number of daunting problems. How should we balance ecological and human needs, and how can we manage urban water bodies for sustainability in the long run? To understand current urban water problems, we must first understand the water itself and the forces that affect it. Where does the water in an urban river come from? We all know that water on the surface of the earth flows downhill. This goes for the water in streams and rivers, as well as the water that feeds into them. Imagine a water drop that falls during a rainstorm. When it hits the earth's surface, wherever it falls, gravity will work to pull it down. As other droplets fall, they begin to join the first and run off the land downhill. Eventually, this runoff may form a distinct rivulet, which may be joined by others, increasing in size as it flows downhill, forming streams and even rivers. Therefore, rain that falls in any area that is uphill of a particular river may eventually contribute to the flow of that river. This area is called the river's watershed. In some cases, water that falls as rain gets absorbed or infiltrates into the ground rather than staying at the surface, similar to watering your houseplants at home. We call this groundwater. Most of the time, groundwater also follows the contours of the land above, and therefore flows more or less downhill. In some places, this groundwater actually comes back out of the ground later, feeding into streams and rivers. Therefore, an urban river gets its water from anywhere in its watershed, as surface runoff or groundwater. As we will see, human development affects the river's watershed and the river itself, altering the ability of the river to meet the needs of humans and animals alike. Withdrawal of water for homes, farms, and industry decreases river flow downstream. Wastewater effluents, road runoff, agricultural fertilizers and pesticides, and industrial contaminants pollute the river and degrade water quality. And destruction of natural habitat by altering the river and clearing its surrounding area eventually sterilizes the river, making it uninhabitable for aquatic species. Therefore, in order to manage urban rivers to provide a sustainable source of water, recreation, and fish for the urban population, it is necessary to consider water quantity, water quality, and habitat when developing management plans for the river and its watershed. Human impacts on urban water bodies can be dramatic. Public awareness of the threat to urban rivers has been increased by terrible events such as the Cuyahoga River catching fire in Ohio, the Rhine River turning red due to a chemical spill in Germany, and recently, the poisoning of the Danube River with cyanide waste from a mine upstream. Fortunately, these disastrous events happen infrequently in developed countries today. More common types of detrimental human impacts are not easily visible to the public. It is these modern problems that pose the most significant challenge to sustainable urban rivers in the 21st century. This is a journey across 3 continents to look at 3 watersheds and the problems they are facing. Our first stop on this journey is the Tama River watershed in Japan. The Tama River has long been used as a source of water for the city of Tokyo and its population of almost 30 million people. The population growth in Tokyo has put an enormous strain on the river and its ability to sustain humans and nature. Tokyo's water supply problems began 350 years ago when the population's demand for water exceeded the capacity available from the small Kanda River that ran through the city. To deal with this water shortage, the city decided to tap into the large Tama River by running a pipeline 43 kilometers to Tokyo. This pipeline was sufficient for almost 200 years, but Tokyo's population eventually outgrew its supply of water yet again.
ただ、それでもですね、需要はどんどん増えていくと。大正、それから昭和に入っていって、東京の発展が目覚ましいということで、人口も増えて、水需要が非常に増えたということでですね、多摩川以外にもですね、水源はないかということで、東京の北側にあります大きな河川の利根川にも水を、水源を求めるべきだということがあったわけですが、非常にその水の調整、水利調整といいますか、他の県から水を持ってくるということは非常に難しい状況だったので、やはり多摩川の開発をさらに進めるべきだということで、昭和の初めですけども、多摩川の最上流に、小河内ダムというダム、容量は1億8000万トン強なんですけども、このダムを作るということになって、小河内ダムができて、東京の水需要を満たすということはその当時はできたわけですが、その後やはり人口が非常に多くなってきて、産業も発達して水をたくさん使うということになりまして、
Water supply problems in Tokyo today are compounded by periodic droughts and a legacy of deteriorating water quality.
東京が人口が膨大化して、それ産業が盛んになるにつれて、公害問題が起きてきます。特に1960年代になりますと、急激な経済発展で産業排水による多摩川の汚染が進んだわけです。で、その問題は例えばシアナイドの問題ですとか、泡が発泡の問題ですとか、さまざまな水質汚濁の問題が全て多摩川の中で現れるということになってきたわけです。で、その過程で、上で水を浄水にとって途中で下水処理水を放流するわけですから、中流域から下流にかけては多摩川の水の半分以上が下水処理水による水というような形が出来上がってきたわけであります。
この場所のようにきれいなところですと、リバーボトムのアルジーのプロダクションが、フードチェーンを通して、インセクトラービーとか魚に行って、魚は、鳥に行って、フードウェップがコンプリート完結しています。 しかし、水質が悪くなってくると、ニュートリエントアイオンが増えてきて、プロダクションがハイパープロダクションになる。そうすると、アナエロビックなデコンポジションが川の底で起こってきます。そうしますと、ナイトレートレスピレーションとか、サルフェートレスピレーションでハイドロセンサルファイトが出て、石の下が黒くなって、動物が住めなくなると、そのような経緯では、魚も少なくなってくるし、もちろん昆虫も少なくなってくる。
これも随分変わってきたわけですね。で、かつては多摩川でたくさん遊んだですね記憶を持っている方もおられるんですけども、水泳場があったりね、それから屋形船を浮かべて、川辺でレクレーションを楽しむとか、あるいは鮎釣りをしたりですね、いろんなレクレーションのですね、都市の人たちのレクレーションの場としてですね、極めて大きな存在だった。で、それと同時に近くの子どもたちにとっては、もう毎日遊びに行く、原っぱであったり、水辺であったりね、川であったりと、こういうような日常的に自然と触れ合うような場であったわけ。今の子どもたちは特に川で遊んじゃいけないというような時代になってきてるんですけども、僕たちの世代からすれば川で遊んだことがものすごく今の人生に役に立ってるみたいなところがあってね。
子供を水辺で遊ばせて勉強させるというようなことが今盛んに行われてますけれども、遊ばせる小学校の先生等にとっては、そこの水が子供にとって安全かどうかということが心配になるわけで、例えば合流式下水道の放流口の下のところでは遊んでいいかというような議論がありますので、そういう水質対策、下水道都市の施設と河川との接合部での水質の対策等も今後必要になるかもわかりません。
With a need for a sustainable water supply, Tokyo has had to think seriously about how to best manage its urban water resources. Although water supply shortages and water quality degradation are found in urban areas throughout the world, the situation in the Tama River watershed may be unique by virtue of the spirit of cooperation that is developed among the various government agencies, academic institutions, and community organizations that together are trying to solve tough water management problems.
多摩川の場合には、1970年頃に多摩川の自然を取り戻そうという運動がですね、市民の間から始まってきました。これは日本で初めての運動なんですけども、約30年前、そういう地域のですね、住民の方々がネットワークを作って、多摩川になんとか昔の自然を取り戻せないかと、こういう運動が始まってきたわけです。それは現在まで続いています。
多摩川方式と我々呼んでるんですけども、市民の皆さんと常に何かあれば議論を重ねるということでスタイルで、我々もそうですし、市民の皆さんもそういったスタイルでやってきてます。で、3つの原則、7つのルールということで、人を非難しないとか、個人攻撃はしないといったルールをですね、あらかじめ決めて、で、皆さんで議論を徹底的に重ねるというのがもう多摩川の伝統的なスタイルになってます。ですので、もう他の流域ではいくつか事例がありますけども、もうまず行政対市民ということでですね、対立の構造から入っていくんではなくて、まず対話から入っていったっていうのがやっぱり多摩川の他との違いだと思います。
This cooperative effort in the Tama River watershed has begun to make headway in approaching a sustainable design for urban water management. Balance is required between the human need for drinking water and recreation and the desire to restore dwindling habitat and protect remaining natural resources. To achieve this balance, the people involved are attempting a mixture of reduced water withdrawal, innovative water treatment, and wastewater reuse.
今から20年ぐらい前まではドリンキングウォーターサプライでこの上流でほとんどの水がなくなってしまいました。 で、この環境はとても干上がって生物が住めないようなところだったんですが、東京ガバメントが、毎秒2トンの水を流すようにした。それは環境に配慮した水を流すようにした。そうして、10年ぐらい経つと、魚も多くなってきたし、ベジテーションも非常にナチュラルになって、いわゆる自然の川が戻ってきたというようなケースに今います。
玉川上水は羽村の取水堰から東京の中心部までかつては流れていたわけですが、ヨドバシ浄水場、新宿のヨドバシ浄水場が廃止された段階で、これは昭和の40年なんですけども、それ以降玉川上水は、上流部は水道の多摩川の水が通ってるわけですが、下流部の方は水が全くなくなってしまったわけですね。で、かつての清流を復活させようということで、下水処理水を、高度処理して、そこの水がなくなった区間に流すということを行いました。これが1986年ということですが、これによって玉川上水、水量的にはかつての水量ほどありませんが、憩いの場としてですね、今もですね、かつての面影を残しているということです。
ということで取り組みを行っております。で、当時ですね、その平瀬川、野川にはパイロット的にその多摩川というのはいろんな新技術がありますと、決まってそのパイロット的に取り組んできた河川でありまして、でその浄化の方法もですね、劣化浄化法ということで、その石を置いて、そこに普通に自然に硫化させてきれいにするというのを取り組んでおります。で、現在もですね、洪水時にはラバー堰といってゴムを点灯させまして、で施設が壊れないようにするんですけど、そういった時には電気とかそういったメンテナンスかかるんですが、平常時にはその自然流下でその石の間を水が流れていって、でメンテナンスフリーということでお金もかからず、で手間もかからないということでですね、現在もそういったことで平成、元年頃に作ったんですけども、今も正常に動いているような状況になっています。
それは、居住との関係がありますから、東京みたいに大変大勢の人が住んでいるところの下流で、そもそも上流域の環境を持とうというのは無理な話でして、それはどうしようもありません。だけど、つまり多摩川の中流域ぐらいの環境が、下の方でも水質でも、水の底の状態でも、それから周囲の河川敷でも、達成されれば、都市に住んでいる人のオアシスというか、そういう利用法として非常にいいんじゃないかなというふうに思います。
多摩川の水を良くするためにはどうすればいいのかっていうのは大体みんな分かってる。だけども実際その生活の中でね、具体的にどうすればいいのかってなかなか難しい。でやっぱりそれには今住んでる大人も含めて、それから子どもたち含めてですね、そこら辺のノウハウをやっぱり教えていかなきゃいけない。自分の生活と流域、あるいは川の環境みたいなものとの関係みたいなものをやっぱりきちんとですね、伝えていかなきゃいけない。そのメカニズムをですね、やっぱり分かってもらわないと、川のですね、水はきれいにならないということがあるわけですね。今の子どもたちはその水どこから来るのっていう話を聞くと、水道のね、家庭の水道の水が一体どこから来るんだろうっていうと、水道の蛇口だっていうような言い方をする。でその飲んでる水がどこから来てるのかということすらなかなかわからない。
Although the primary concern for the people of Tokyo is an adequate supply of water, they have come to realize that the quality of the water is directly related to the amount available. By using less water from the Tama River in the first place and treating urban wastewater more effectively, it becomes more feasible to reuse the water downstream for industry and recreation, and helps maintain the natural environment even in an urban setting. But dealing with sewage is one thing. Dealing with hazardous waste is another. Managing urban water resources contaminated with toxic chemicals is a problem being faced in the Aberjona River watershed just north of Boston, Massachusetts. The Aberjona River and its tributaries run through 9 heavily populated towns, including Woburn and Winchester. The industrial history of this area has been a magnet for urban development, but it has also set the stage for long-term contamination problems.
I got involved with the Aberjona River in July of 1979 when I came home from the hospital with my second child and found out that I live here in this home, which is 3/4 of a mile from the Industriplex site, which was at that time listed as number 5 on the national priorities list, and the EPA considered it one of the largest hazardous waste sites in the country. And we learned that the first chemical company was located on the banks of the Aberjona in 1850, I think it was, and that was known as the Woburn Chemical Works, which later became the Merrimack Chemical Company. From the Woburn Chemical Works, it grew into one of the largest chemical manufacturing operations in New England. And as was the problem in the past, or the practice in the past, waste was dumped out behind the property. We also began to document the various tanneries. There were over 100 tanneries located on the banks of the Aberjona, which spanned approximately a 100-year history. And again, waste from those tanneries was dumped in the river and on the banks of the river and out on the properties of the tanneries.
This early concentration of industry during an era when the impacts of toxic waste disposal were not well understood, left behind a legacy of contamination that continues to this day. This legacy includes 2 Superfund sites in Woburn, the Wells G&H site and the Industriplex 128 site. Wells G&H were drinking water wells supplying the town of Woburn. When organic solvents were detected in the water and a high incidence of childhood leukemia was found in the local residents, the site received considerable media attention. On the other hand, the even more potentially devastating contaminants at the Industriplex site upstream have gone largely unnoticed by the public.
We're standing at the north end of the Halls Brick holding area. This small pond is adjacent to a former industrial area on which a variety of chemical manufacturing operations took place during the past century. The sort of manufacturing that occurred includes munitions manufacture, especially during World War I, also the manufacture of arsenical-based pesticides, and finally sulfuric acid manufacture. A result of this has been released to the environment of a variety of both organic and inorganic compounds. Many of the organics include those associated with manufacture of explosives, the solvents that are ubiquitous on almost any industrial site. And among the inorganics, we particularly have paid attention to arsenic and also lead.
There was a large area of soil contamination. So what was done at that site to prevent direct contact with that soil was a cap was constructed, generally consisting of a geotextile layer, which is a synthetic fabric type material, covered over the contamination, and then over that a layer of clean soil. It was innovative for its time, I think, to actually construct the cap around operating businesses, make sure that they can still operate. So it was kind of a unique brownfields movement, and it's one of the original sites.
Now that the original contamination site has been capped and redeveloped, the threat of direct contamination within the Industriplex site has been controlled. However, from a watershed perspective, the potential for harm is far from over.
Well, what we see here is evidence that this pond is directly down gradient, or downstream, if you will, from the industrial site. And this reddish material that we see is iron, which has been reduced or chemically solubilized within the soil and made transportable by groundwater. As it seeps to the surface here, it reoxidizes and forms these bright orange iron oxyhydroxides. Now, along with this iron have come a variety of metals, most notably arsenic, which has been reduced and solubilized by the same sort of process that has taken this iron into solution. And this arsenic is also being transported with the groundwater and is coming to the surface along with the iron.
Those sediments are being distributed throughout the river. And we have been told repeatedly by some of the government agencies that we don't need to worry about that anymore because those sediments will become buried. Eventually will become buried, but the mechanism is ongoing and those sediments are not becoming buried. And the Aberjona River floods periodically, and recently we've had one or two instances of 100-year floods.
We first became concerned about the Aberjona River during the heavy storms that we had. We had two real heavy storms that created a great deal of flooding in the area of a section of town called Davison Park. And during those storms, the water inundated a lot of the property of the residents, and we were concerned because of the industrial plex property in Woburn and what contamination would be in the river that's being deposited upon the property of the residents along the Aberjona River. So we were able to, with the cooperation and the assistance of the MIT group, Dr. Eamon and Dr. Bravander, we were able to get them to come in and do some testing along the Aberjona River. And we were surprised at with the counts that we got, the high levels of arsenic.
Well, there has been talk about just declaring the whole watershed a disaster area. There are houses all along the banks of the river. There's recreational areas and parks along the banks of the river. People go there and they're unaware of the fact that they're walking along or their kids are playing in high levels of arsenic, chromium, and lead.
In the east, I don't think that we have the luxury of writing off an urban watershed. I mean, in the Mystic River watershed, which includes the Aberjona, there are maybe 7 or 8% of the population of Massachusetts living here. And that's a lot of people, and you can't just write off their environment, the one that they live in and drink water out of and spend time in every day. So in this watershed, there seems to be a big tie-in between low economic communities, low economic bracket communities, and pollution. This is the case all over, I'm sure. It's certainly the case in Massachusetts. And there was a recent study done on environmental justice, and out of the 15 most heavily impacted communities in the state, in Massachusetts, for negative environmental impacts, 8 out of the 15 are actually in the Mystic River watershed. So I think that not only is it doing a disservice to the community as a whole to ignore urban rivers, but it's actually targeting the poorest and most economically disadvantaged people that we have.
There are no simple answers to the problems facing the Aberjona watershed. The need for urban green space must be balanced with the mandate to protect human health and the desire to protect the remnants of a natural environment that exists along urban waterways. What is clear is that the Superfund process may actually work contrary to the ideals of sustainable water management.
Superfund is the law, it's a liability law in that it establishes how the government can establish the responsible people for the contamination found at a site. Generally, the properties that are part of the site themselves are very much a part of the process. And after decision made at the site, often we see a drop-off in the participation of the community.
It wasn't science that drove the decision making, but it also was the lack of public process and the lack of a collaborative process among the various entities involved. And as science developed, as we knew more about the site, as we knew more about the extent of contamination, the decision about how to clean up the site never changed. And so it wasn't driven by the science, it was driven by this negotiated settlement. And it's done a tremendous disservice to us.
Well, for the most part, everyone has very similar goals, and that is to improve the environment and to improve the water quality of watersheds and rivers and streams. I mean, certainly nobody wants to have it degraded. So we do have that common goal. But sometimes there are differing opinions on how we meet those goals. So that's where some conflict may arise.
For a state organization such as DEP, they're often limited by budgets. One of the first things I did when I started was to look back on water quality data in this watershed. And the further back in time I looked, the more the state seemed to do. And the more recent in time I got, the less the state seemed to do. And it was directly a result of budget cuts, and that led to cutting staffing, and that led to less work being done by the state. So in many ways, we've had to take up the slack in those situations.
I think the first thing they should do is start from the source and do the necessary testing all the way down the Aberdona and see where the problems are, see how bad the problems are, then take a look at how we can do is clean it up. And if you can clean it up, but you got to stop it at the source. And if the source is the leachate from the industrial plex site, then they have to do something with some kind of intercept drains or whatever to stop the leachate. And then continue on and do what they should be doing down below.
We are balancing, on the one hand, risks associated with exposure to this contamination against people's right to and need to use these water resources, and of course the economic and political realities associated with various cleanup measures.
They did have a meeting here about a couple of months ago with some of the representatives from the congressmen, the senators, and as a result of that, I think we were starting to get somebody to begin to listen. Up until then, nobody was listening. But I think that that meeting they had with the EPA and so forth, which is how many years later? How many years later?
You know, at the very beginning of this whole thing, when the industrial plex was first identified, DEP commissioned a study to cap the industrial plex for $100,000. They were going to cap the industrial plex site, and all they were going to do is dump about 12 inches of soil on the whole site. Well, $50 million later, I think it is, basically what we have is a $100,000 solution.
The legalistic nature of Superfund designation and the economic penalties for the parties involved have created an atmosphere of secrecy and mistrust in the Aberjona watershed quite different from the situation in Tokyo. Ironically, it seems that it is only today, after the remediation strategies for the Industriplex and Wells G&H sites have been finalized, that the real work of designing a sustainable water management plan for the entire watershed can begin. Farther to the east, across the Atlantic, the residents of the Terce River watershed in Switzerland are facing a very different situation. Although the river here is a relatively clean and abundant water source, the restoration of the natural environment may prove to be the most difficult goal to achieve.
Am Ende des Mittelalters wurde das Einzugsgebiet der Tös stark abgeholzt, in einem Ausmaß, dass im 19. Jahrhundert vor allem sehr viele außerordentlich hohe Hochwässer vorkamen und sehr viel Zerstörung anrichteten. Das ist oder war der Hauptgrund, warum die Tös verbaut wurde. Sehr stark in ein enges Korsett gelegt, das eigentlich bis heute aufrechterhalten wurde.
Switzerland has a long history of managing its rivers and constraining them for flood protection. And in this particular valley, the Linsental, they started this about 1820 and had constrained it completely by the end of the 1800s, basically forcing it into a narrow channel of equal width of about 20 meters along its entire course. And through this constraining, the river downcut below the old floodplain level by about 3 to 4 meters. And once the river had downcut that far, they put all these crossbars into the river, which you can still see the remnants of, so it wouldn't downcut any further. And this was done on most of the rivers in Switzerland because Switzerland was really into engineering all of its floodplain rivers because land was so valuable.
Okay, die Situation ist so in der Schweiz, dass wir ein Land haben mit einer sehr hohen Bevölkerungsdichte. Die Leute, die konzentrieren sich auf das Mittelland, das ungefähr 1/3 der Landesfläche ausmacht. Und hier haben wir Bevölkerungsdichten von 500, 600, 700 pro Quadratkilometer. Wir haben eine sehr hohe ökonomische Aktivität. Wir haben unterschiedlichste Interessen an den Gewässern.
Ja, ich denke, die Probleme in der Schweiz, die sind schon sehr speziell, weil die Schweiz hat vermutlich einen der höchsten Anteil der verbauten Fließgewässer weltweit. Viele Fische, die halten sich vor allem in Ufernähe auf und sind also darauf angewiesen, dass diese Ufer in einem relativ natürlichen Zustand sich befinden. Beispielsweise einige Fischarten, Kleinfischarten, hochgefährdete Fischarten wie der Strömer zum Beispiel, haben wir im unteren Teil der Tös nachweisen können, dass sie vor allem solche Strukturen brauchen. Und zum Teil sind es auch abgekoppelte Pools, die nicht in direkter Verbindung sind mit dem Fluss, die für die Besiedlung der Fische sehr wichtig sind. Also diese seitlichen Verbindungen, das Einbeziehen vom Flussufer ist für die Fische sehr wichtig. Auch die Forelle zum Beispiel, eine sehr deckungsorientierte, unterstandsorientierte Fischart, die hält sich vor allem am Ufer des Flusses auf und nicht in der Flussmitte. Und das ist dann ein wesentliches Problem im oberen Töstal, wo der Fluss stark kanalisiert ist. Da haben wir praktisch einen sehr starken Wegfall und manch einen kompletten Wegfall der Uferpartien, die von Fischen als Unterstand verwendet werden können.
Of course, now since everything has been engineered to the hilt in Switzerland, more than probably any other country, things are going back in the other direction. You want to get habitat back. You want to protect species. You want to have a natural environment because that is something that is valued highly.
Unfortunately, it is not possible to simply return the river to its original state. As in so many places in the world, river floodplains are valuable areas for development. In Switzerland, as in much of Europe, it is difficult to find locations where unengineering the river is politically feasible. Along the Thurs, the Liesenthal Valley is a prime location for renaturalization, but even there, conflicts arose as the area surrounding the river was being used to supply groundwater to the city of Winterthur, with a population of over 100,000.
Diese verschiedenen Interessen zur Nutzung des Landes mussten über kurz oder lang zu einem Konflikt führen. Man kann nicht in einem Gebiet versuchen, Ufer von einem infiltrierenden Bach zu verändern, ohne dass man eben die Auswirkungen auf das Trinkwasser abklären muss. Die Wasserwerke Winterthur waren besorgt über mögliche Auswirkungen einer Renaturierung der Tös auf ihr Trinkwasser, die da sind auf der einen Seite eine Verkleinerung der Aufenthaltszeiten vom Fluss bis zum Pumpwerk, ein größerer Mischungsanteil, dass vielleicht alles nur noch Töswasser war, das in das Pumpwerk gelangen könnte und damit natürlich auch eine Frage der Wasserqualität. Wenn die Tös Hochwasser hat, bringt sie allerlei mit sich und wir wissen nicht genau, ob sich da nicht einmal Schadstoffe drin vorfinden würden. Und dieser Konflikt, den galt es zu lösen.
And there we found that almost all the time, except in particular high runoff situations, that it takes the water about 3 months to get from the river into the drinking water extraction sites. So if we do open up this valley in the renaturalization project, there is very little to no chance that the water from right here is actually going to get way down to where we're extracting the drinking water. I think this is a case study where you can show that you can use science to make political decisions, that there is actually an information base that can be used to say, okay, we can open this river system up.
The large human population of the Terce River watershed means that public involvement in river management design is imperative for any project to be accepted and successful. One of the unique outcomes of the project to revitalize the Terce has been the way that the public participants have organized themselves to ensure that their voice is heard.
Vor mehr als 10 Jahren haben verschiedene Organisationen, die auf dem Platz Winterthur im Natur- und Umweltschutz arbeiten, gemerkt, dass sie eigentlich alle Interesse haben an diesem Gebiet. Aber wir haben auch gemerkt, dass alle verschiedene Interessen haben. Und wir haben gemerkt, dass es einfach besser ist, zusammenzuarbeiten, weil man dann gegenüber dem Kanton, gegenüber dem Staat, aber auch gegenüber den Gemeinden zusammen auftreten kann und stärker ist.
The Swiss want a very clean environment. That's very important for them. They like cleanliness, but they also like orderliness. And orderliness is something that doesn't always go hand in hand with nature. People are realizing this. People want a wilder environment. And so the public is actually moving the agencies to try to do things like they are here.
Another hallmark of the efforts to restore natural habitat along the Terce is the relative freedom given to government agencies to be inventive in their restoration designs. In some respects, the Terce River is a testing ground for innovative designs that may be used in other rivers in Switzerland or elsewhere.
Auf der rechten Seite haben wir Buhnen eingebaut, Buhnen aus Tannenwipfeln, rund 40 Tannenwipfel pro Buhne. Und die haben sich sehr schön entwickelt, da hat es viele Fische drunter, die man hier lange nicht mehr gesehen hat. Auch der Eisvogel ist heute wieder darin, Ringelnatter, also verschiedene Tiere fühlen sich wohl. ...500 Meter von hier abwärts haben wir eine Schwelle eingebaut. Und das ist eine neuartige Schwelle, die neu entwickelt wurde. Und sie hat die Form eines Vs. V darum, wenn der Fluss kommt, geht er im rechten Winkel von diesem V weg. Das heißt, die Strömung konzentriert sich in der Mitte, gräbt dort ein Loch, das ist gut für die Fische. Und es gibt eine Entlastung für den Uferbereich. Das heißt, wir haben dort nicht mehr so große Probleme.
Ja, vor allem im oberen Linsental haben wir teilweise eine sehr hohe Dichte von Kleinfischen, von Groppen. Diese Fische sind eigentlich sehr schlechte Schwimmer und nicht in der Lage, nur schon 20-30 cm hohe Barrieren zu überwinden. Wir haben deshalb mit dem zuständigen Flussbauer haben wir eine Rampe, also wir haben mit ihm diskutiert und er hat dann eine Rampe gebaut nach unseren Vorschlägen. Und diese Rampe war eine relativ steile Rampe, aber es gab keine Situationen mehr, wo ein Fisch springen muss. Und mit Hilfe von dieser Rampe war es möglich, dass diese kleinen Fische, also diese klein gewachsenen Fische, diese Groppe, nach oben aufwandern konnte. Wir haben das mit markierten Fischen nachweisen können und erstaunlicherweise hat das sehr gut funktioniert.
If you open up a river like this, you will find other surface water bodies on the floodplain surface, like ponds, like spring brooks, like old oxbow arms, which are like little lakes. There's very many amphibians who need ponds like this for their early life stages, the tadpoles. And all of that's been lost here. Because this has been downcut so low, you don't have any of these floodplain ponds anymore. They're all gone. And if you do recreate a floodplain like that, you'll get them all back.
Yet the most difficult part of the restoration efforts along the Terce is still to come. The Liesenthal Valley was a relatively easy place to start since the river there is surrounded by forest land owned by the canton of Zurich. Bringing some degree of natural habitat to the rest of the river may prove to be much more difficult, but necessary for long-term sustainability.
Wenn wir Revitalisierungsmaßnahmen an der Tös durchführen, denke ich, müssen wir das Tös-System auch eben als ganzes System betrachten. Es ist sicher sinnvoll, wenn wir einzelne Punkte, die in einem sehr schlechten Zustand sind, verbessern, aber es muss immer in einem Kontext des ganzen Flusssystems gedacht werden.
In Zukunft möchte sich die Proteus noch stärker auch mit dem Fluss auf Stadtgebiet von Winterthur beschäftigen. Es ist klar, dass dort nicht wahnsinnig viel herauszuholen ist für die Naturwerte im Einzelnen, weil natürlich die Umgebung zu eng ist, weil die Stadt zu nahe am Fluss ist. Aber wir erhoffen uns auch dort mit dem Schaffen von dynamischeren Strukturen, von Kiesbänken, von Uferbuchten, dass vor allem auch für die Bevölkerung mehr Verständnis geschaffen wird für Revitalisierungen anderenorts, dass Naherholungsraum geschaffen wird, dass die Tös nicht mehr einfach nur eine Abflussrinne ist in der Stadt, sondern wirklich auch ein möglichst lebendiger Fluss.
The goals of sustainable water management are not new or difficult to grasp, but they are not easy to achieve either. Sustainability requires that there be an adequate supply of relatively clean water while allowing for the maximum protection of aquatic habitat. These goals go hand in hand. For example, it is difficult to ensure an adequate supply of usable water without also addressing the need for clean water. Habitat protection, on the other hand, supports biological processes that help to purify water, while also supplying the aesthetic and recreational needs of an ever-increasing urban population. The Tama, Aberjona, and Terce rivers are not unique. Rather, they are examples of the problems facing all urban populations today. Maybe the solutions being tested in these three watersheds will help solve similar problems in other locations in the future. Although the people in each watershed are approaching the task of sustainable water management in different ways, there is one common characteristic among all of them. In all cases, it has been shown that the involvement of watershed users is imperative. Therefore, public education is required if a successful management design is to be achieved. Today's urban water problems are difficult to see without a knowledge of watershed processes and the impact of human development. Through education, the problems become visible. Only then can solutions be found to protect our precious urban waters.